here. If you are visiting, by the way, we're in 1 Kings, and we're going through the book of 1 Kings, and we finished up chapter 3 last week. And so this week, we're kind of going to sprint through 3 chapters, because in chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, predominantly chapters 5, 6, and 7, actually, what you have there is the construction of the temple. And so this is something that we could spend a ton of time on, but I just want to keep on moving and look at the application. And so we are going to deal with it today, and we're going to deal with it somewhat in depth, but we're going to try and deal with it all at once today. And hopefully we won't have to, we won't get bogged down in a 3-week study of the construction of the temple. So with that, go ahead and open up your Bibles to 1 Kings. And before we get into that, just a quick review where we left off. We finished up 1 Kings chapter 3, and chapter 3 was a huge chapter. We spent a couple weeks there, and that's, of course, where Solomon, he's finally been established as the king of Israel, and he's just, as a young man, he goes to God and he prays, and what does he ask for? What's the one thing that he asks for? He can ask for anything, and he asks for what? Wisdom. Yeah, just wisdom so that he can lead God's people, right? And so what does God do? He gives him wisdom, he says, but also because you didn't ask for honor and riches and ask for wisdom, I'm going to also give you honor and wisdom. Your name's going to be greater than any king. And he says you're going to be wiser than any person before and any person after you. And so what we see from here on out is that wisdom taking effect in Solomon's life. And we see, and what we're going to see right here is we're really reaching a pinnacle in the story of 1 Kings. Because what we started off talking about in the introduction of this class was that 1 Kings is the story of what happens when man chooses their own plan over God's, right? Because they put up a man as their king when they should have chosen God as their king. But what we've seen up to this point, with the exception of a king being established, you have that rivalry going on between Adonijah and Solomon. But after that, we see things are going pretty well. And we see that in chapters 5, 6, and 7, as we'll read here, this is going to be a pinnacle of this book, and a pinnacle in the history of the monarchy of Israel. And so 1 Kings, I think I would describe the book kind of as that first part of a roller coaster. You ever go on a roller coaster and it's going until it gets to the very top, and then all of a sudden it does a nosedive, right? So we're approaching the top right now of that roller coaster, and what we're going to see is Solomon's going to have his heart turned away, and that's when his son Rehoboam takes over, and that's where the divided kingdom begins. But before we get into that, just a review, we finished up 1 Kings chapter 3, and so Solomon gets that wisdom, and immediately we see it take effect in what event? What happens? Yeah, he has 2 women, 2 prostitutes that approach him. And that's interesting because he's a king, but here he's dealing with, the problems of the commoner of Israel, of sinners, and he's hearing them out. And so here's this baby, and they both have a baby, and one of them rolls over their baby in its sleep and kills and crushes the baby. And so one of the moms says, here's what I'm going to do, I'm going to switch the babies. And of course, the mama wakes up and she recognizes what's wrong, obviously. And so you have this dispute going on between these 2 women, one saying, that's my baby, and the other one saying, no, it's my baby. And so what does Solomon do to solve this?
Cut it in half.
Yeah, just cut it in half. And he does it differently than I would do it. If it were me, I'd say, okay, I'm going to cut the baby in half, and you guys can't decide, and I'm going to go and grab a sword, and that would kind of give me time to kind of back out of it, and they wouldn't call me on my bluff, hopefully, while I'm going to get the sword. But Solomon, what does he do? He says, bring me the sword, and then he says, this is what we're going to do. And he raises the sword, and he's about to strike the baby. And so what happens? The real mom says, no, she can keep it. And Solomon says, okay, this is the real mom, because the real mom would never let that happen to a child. And so we look at that, and it was that event, a relatively small event when you look at the dealings of a king, right? But it was that event that caused everybody in all Israel, verse 28, it caused all Israel to heard the judgment the king had rendered. And they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. And so it's this one event where he gives ear to the oppressed, and he gets the facts even though they were unobtainable. He solves the situation. He skillfully uses his wisdom to find a solution, and that's where everybody realizes that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. And so you see that he obtains this wisdom, but then he begins to spread his wisdom. And it's after he has his prayer before God that the kingdom really starts to take off. And so that's where we pick up in chapter 4. And real quick before we move on, I did want to mention that the solution to problems when we're dealing in a situation like Solomon isn't always to cut the baby in half, is it? That was a unique situation, but certainly there's something that we can learn from that he made a bold decision, and sometimes it's not black and white. Yeah, what were you
Well,
gonna
it's
say?
interesting because when you look at the two women, the difference between the birth of the babies was 3 days.
Yeah.
So it'd be hard to determine, that on that basis.
Yeah.
And of course they didn't have DNA. So, he used the system that he did, and it was very effective because he knew that he would pull on the heart of the mother.
Yeah.
And that's the wisdom that God gave.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it worked just as he knew it
Yeah,
would.
it's the right move in the right situation. That's how wisdom works. It's not always easy to figure out what to do, but somebody who's wise can take what's been taught to them in the Bible or take what's been taught to them from other people, and they can apply it in every realm of life in unique ways and unique situations. And so sometimes we take a bold approach, and sometimes we take a more roundabout approach, but this situation it called for a bold approach. Yeah.
That was also a very passionate issue, and so by him doing that, he kind of fed on the passion and the stress that they had over that. I mean, nothing affects a mother more than her child.
Yeah.
And so if somebody had been blasé, it may not have gone over as well. But the fact that they were so upset about it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I was talking to Rochelle last week, and she was talking to me and saying how it does give insight, and I appreciate what she said. It gives insight into Solomon's own relationship with his own mother, Bathsheba, because he knew what to do based off of, the relationship, it seems, with his mother. He knew that his mother would never let him die, no matter what the situation was. And so he takes that experience and he judges accordingly and looks at it and says, well, there's no way that this would happen. I don't know, it's just kind of interesting. It seems to give insight into the special relationship between Bathsheba and Solomon. Bathsheba losing her first child and then finally being blessed with Solomon. But anyways, we move on to chapter 4. I'm sorry just to kind of blow through that, but we have a lot of material to go over. But we pick up in 1 Kings chapter 4, and it says that King Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were his high officials. And it goes on and it lists all his officials. These would have been the people in his inner cabinet, people giving him advice, people helping him in his reign. And so what you see immediately is that Solomon is kind of delegating his authority. And it says that Solomon in verse 7 had 12 officers over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each man had to make provisions for 1 month in the year. And so again, we see him kind of delegating leadership responsibilities. And this is something that wise leaders do all throughout the Bible. Do you remember with Moses? Moses was obviously the leader in Israel, leading them out of the land of Egypt. And what does it say in Exodus? That he was busy day and night judging the disputes of the people. And so Jethro finally approaches him. What does Jethro tell him to do?
Don't do it all.
Yeah, don't do it all on your own. Look, appoint some leaders, appoint some judges to help you carry this burden because it's too much for one man. And so we see the same thing here with Solomon. We see that the church is set up in that same way, that you have elders, and even in the book of Acts, the elders were burdened with making sure that the widows were getting their daily rations and there all these different responsibilities, and it was taking them away from more important works of the ministry. And so what do? Well, they appoint men and they delegate these certain roles and responsibilities that are taking up their time so that they can use their time for something more valuable. And we even think about Jesus and his apostles. He certainly delegates them and gives them authority to go out and preach and teach and to perform miracles and all these types of things. And so this is just the mark of good leadership, not taking and putting too much on yourself, especially Solomon being as young as he was. We talked about that. He was anywhere between the age of 12 to 20. There's several estimates on that. And so he knew early on that he's got to depend and rely on other people. He can't just do it all on his own. And sometimes we forget that. I know certainly I'm that way, kind of as a stubborn man. I'll kind of rely on my own self. But when we're surrounded with good, godly people, we shouldn't be ashamed to rely on them and ask for help. And we can't be too proud to do that. And Solomon certainly doesn't appear to be too proud to do that himself. But you see, I have this map up here. it talks about how he appointed 12 officials over the land of Israel, and it goes into detail on that, verses 7 through 18, or 7 through 19 actually. And this is just kind of a map showing that delegation process. And really this wasn't to appoint people to govern these districts. That's not what it was. It wasn't like, the United States of Israel or anything like that. But really what it came down to was it was for tax purposes. And what we read here is that each district had to provide 1 month of provisions out of the year. And so we read about kind of some of what those provisions are, starting in verse 22 rather. It says Solomon's provisions for 1 day. This is just 1 day. Was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, beside deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tiphach to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides around him. But you look at the provisions that were just for 1 day. And I was looking at that 30 cores of fine flour. As you break that out, it shows you just how many people that Solomon had at his immediate disposal. There's some estimates on this. But just with that flour alone, it would produce 2 pounds, or let's see here, now I gotta think, 28,000 pounds of bread is what it would be. And so, if you gave each person 2 pounds of bread in his cabinet, well then that ends up being 14,000 individuals. And so that's kind of an estimate, but that's just the flour alone. He had twice as much meal, and then you see all the different animals that he had for meat. He had 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, beside deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowls. And so you see that the kingdom, it's just blossoming. And we even read in that first verse that it says, Israel was as many as the sand by the sea. What is that reminiscent of?
The promise to Abraham.
The promise to Abraham, right? And so we're seeing that promise is fulfilled, that Abraham's descendants are as the sands by the sea, the stars of the sky, right? And so here Solomon is, and he has 14,000 people that are just at his immediate disposal. And you think about just how much has grown since the time of David even. And so how many people did David kind of have in his inner circle of people? Does anybody know? There's actually not a specific number. It doesn't list it. But
he had 400 people before he became king.
well, and so remember when he left, after Absalom rebelled against him, he left and he had 600 people go with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so you think those are kind of the people in his inner circle. Well, Solomon has 14,000. And so you see just how it's just exploding. And God is blessing him in this kingdom immensely, isn't it? And so obviously impressive. They have abundance of comfort in verse 25. It says, Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. And so you see, not only are they just growing in number, they're becoming this great nation, but they have peace, and they're enjoying comfort, every man under his fig tree. That certainly paints an illustration, doesn't it? It's just blissful peace, isn't it? But the problem with that is when you have it so good, when you got all the food in the world, when you're a wealthy nation, when you're comfortable, what typically happens to man the more comfortable that we get?
Rely on yourself rather than God.
Yeah, rely on yourself rather than God. I think sometimes we forget about God. It seems the times when we're most comfortable are the times where we obviously rely on God the least, because we get comfortable and we forget to attribute these great things to God, and we become puffed up, so to speak. And so we go through the hard times, and that reminds us, oh yeah, I do need God. And so, but they're just extremely comfortable. One thing I want to point out that's important, and we look at this, and it says right here in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 20, Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. What's significant about the author including the fact, just including and telling us the area where he ruled? What's significant about that? It says that the kingdom he reigned over was from the Euphrates to the Philistines, to the border of Egypt. What's significant about that? Any ideas?
It's
gonna guess that maybe it's because the Philistines, which they did drive them out when they should have earlier.
Well, that's certainly an idea, but I think what it really comes down to, and maybe this is, I don't mean it to be a trick question, but it says, in Genesis 15:18, one of the promises that was given to Abraham is that on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land. So he's showing him the land of Canaan, and he says, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And so you look at Solomon, and we kind of look, and you do the map, and that's the Mediterranean Sea, right? And then you got the Sea of Galilee, and then the Red Sea, and that's kind of like a hook like that. And then you got Egypt down here, right? And then you got like this river Euphrates kind of going up here. And you look from here to here, it's Solomon. Now, it might seem like a waste of time that I'm bringing this out, but the reason why it's important is because we talk about premillennialism, and one of the things that people talk about, and one of the reasons why they think Jesus needs to come down and establish his reign on earth is because they think that the land prophecies haven't been fulfilled yet, that they haven't received the land yet. And so here what you have is you have the promise being made to Abraham, saying that here's the land that I'm going to give you. You're going to have the land from the Euphrates River all the way down to the border of Egypt. And what we just read is that Solomon, he ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And so that's fulfillment of prophecy we see in Solomon's reign. It's a fulfillment of Abraham's prophecy, and it just blows my mind that people don't realize that this prophecy has already been fulfilled. It was fulfilled even in the days of Joshua, but this just repeats the fact again. And so I just bring that out briefly just so we're aware of that. There's little statements that are made as we read the Bible that they have significance, and they affect doctrine, and they shape people's beliefs, and even looking at something such as premillennialism, the idea of Jesus coming back to reign on earth again. We see that it's false. But I'm not going to spend a ton of time going over premillennialism. I just thought I'd kind of throw out that nugget for you guys. And so you go on, and we keep on reading in chapter 4, and it's just going through just talking about Solomon and the things that he had. It says Solomon had, it should say 4,000 stalls of horses. I know some translations say 40,000. I think that's a copying error. We read the Chronicles account, I think it's 1 Chronicles 9:23, it says 4,000 stalls. And so that happens sometimes. The translations of the Bible, they aren't inspired. The original documents aren't inspired. We have copies. And so sometimes there's these copying errors like that. But he has 4,000 stalls of horses for his chariots, 12,000 horsemen, and those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon. And for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. Barley, also straw for the horses and swift steeds, brought to the place where it was required, and according to his duty. And it goes on, and it talks about Solomon's duty, or Solomon's wisdom. It says, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore. So God's just, again, blessing him with wisdom. He's a genius, smarter than anybody, more wise than anybody, as God promised he would be. Clinton, were you going to say something? Yeah.
That 3, 4 to 12, so back when they used chariots, they were full of 2 horses. They took 3.
3, yep.
If one died, they still had 2 horses. So
Yep.
that makes that number. And they found that in archaeological digs where it showed 3 horses hooked to a chariot.
Yep. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, totally. And so Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan, the Ezrahite, and Heman, which it's interesting. Those are 2 people. There's a couple of psalms that are attributed to those guys. Calcol and Darda, the sons of Michal, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. And so not only is he getting more wise and more understanding, not only are they flourishing as a nation, but his fame is growing. That's how wise he is that people are beginning to hear about him and hear about who he is. And it says he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish, and people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. And so you see that he just seemed to speak about every single thing under the sun, didn't he? He had something to say about every realm of life. Yeah.
I was going to say, wisdom was obviously something that was noted and held in high esteem.
Yep.
Because he had other people who they considered to be very wise.
Yeah.
And these people were established, and now you have a young boy coming up that has more wisdom than them. So it's a marked person that, you know, everybody can say, wow, you know, it's like the Muhammad Ali of the boxing, you know, this young kid comes up and he rules the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's another thing that gives glory to God, right? Is that he's so young, and yet he's already so wise. And I think it does give credence to the fact that this is a unique situation where, you know, we talked last week about how God sometimes will put us in circumstances to gain wisdom, or we can, you know, wisdom often is a process, or in gaining it anyways. But with Solomon, it seemed to just be instant, that God just blessed him with wisdom, and he began to just, his intellect grew from there. Yeah.
Something, Sam, we have to deal with though with Solomon is that even though God blessed him to administer justice with great wisdom, it doesn't mean that he always applied that wisdom to his own life's actions.
Yeah.
And we're going to see that happen with Solomon. He doesn't always make wise choices in his own life.
Yeah,
and that's kind of a conundrum, you know.
Yeah, sometimes he applies it in a worldly way, at least, doesn't he? It seems like he never does something that the world would say is stupid. He'll make a wise political move, but is it wise in God's eyes, right? So in other words, marrying Pharaoh's daughter seems like a savvy political move, but in the eyes of God, it's foolish because it's showing a lack of faithfulness towards God, right? And so, yeah, no, I appreciate that. And so that's kind of chapter 4. I know that's quick, but I want to get into temple construction. But you see that Solomon, what he's doing is he's just spreading his wisdom. And his wisdom is beginning to spread within his own nation. It's affecting how he rules. He's delegating his leadership. But it's also beginning to spread throughout the known world. People are beginning to hear his name. He's writing things down. We have things that are written down by him. We think about the book of Proverbs is attributed to him. We think Song of Solomon. There's some Psalms that are attributed to him. Ecclesiastes is often typically attributed to him as well. And so we're benefiting from the wisdom that everybody was marveling at all those years ago, still to this day. And so God makes good on his promise that he'd make him more wise than anybody before or anybody after him. Any other comments or questions before we move on to chapter 5? Yeah.
Well, I go back to when they made the first king. God said, he will take your very best of everything.
Yeah.
And look what Solomon's done. I mean, look at the amount of food and everything that he's required.
Yeah.
And the nation has to support that.
Yeah, exactly. And you looked at just what was being supplied to like his inner cabinet of people, his daily provisions are crazy, isn't it? Yeah. I appreciate that. So in chapter 5, we see that the building of the temple starts here, and it starts with just simply gaining materials for it. And so what Solomon does is he first strikes up a deal with Hiram, king of Tyre, and we'll just read verses 3 through 7, and it's here that Solomon reaches out to the king of Tyre, and this is where it was known that the cedars of Lebanon, they were known for their trees, and so Solomon reaches out to him and he says, you know that David my father could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given us rest on every side. There's neither adversary nor misfortune, and so I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord said to David my father, your son whom I will set on your throne in your place shall build a house for my name. Now therefore command that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. My servants will join your servants, and I will pay you for your servants such wages as you said. For you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. And here Hiram replies, and once he receives word of this, he rejoiced greatly. In verse 7 it says, blessed be the Lord this day. This is what Hiram says. Blessed be the Lord this day, who has given to David a wise son to be over this great people. And so just a couple things that I find interesting about this. You see that Solomon, he goes back to a relationship that his father David previously took advantage of. We know that David took advantage of this same relationship with Hiram to help build his palace, and so David had cedars from Lebanon shipped to him from Hiram, king of Tyre, a Jew. He says, "Blessed be the Lord this day," and so he certainly appears to be God-fearing. And so that's interesting because you see that the nation of Israel goes in, they infiltrate this Canaanite nation, and it does look like, at least in the days of David, they were influencing nations around them. And it's not always the case that the Canaanites were influencing them, although that's ultimately what ends up being the reality. But it seems that they were setting an example to those who had honest hearts and were watching what was going on. But I found that interesting. And so they strike up this deal, and they agree, and Hiram agrees to send cedars of Lebanon to start building this temple. And in exchange, Solomon, he's going to send him wheat and send him other food. And so they have a trade going on. And in verse 13 it says, "The Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty." So there's peace between them. And then, let's see here for a second. It's just interesting to see the amount of workers that Solomon hired. It says that Solomon drafted forced labor out of Israel. He has 30,000 men of Israel for forced labor, 70,000 burden bearers, which is, I would assume, people who just simply carried things. As you look at it in the Hebrew, all the trees and all the stones that were hewn and were set aside for building the temple, 80,000 stone cutters, and then 3,300 people to look over all this. These are the supervisors that sit here like this, right, and make sure everything's going okay. But you have almost 200,000 people there just for timber and stone alone, and then the 3,300 people watching over it. And so you just have this sea of people that are contributing to building this house of God. Yeah, Clint.
All those people in that number, though, were enemies in David's time.
Mm-hmm.
He conscripted every blessed one of them. They all had to be slaves. All opposing nations.
Yeah, that's right. So that's an important thing. And in 1 Kings 9, I think in verse 22, it makes a clarification that Solomon didn't draft anybody of Israel to be a slave.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the Jewish nation. The people that were made slaves were Canaanites who were dwelling in the land of Israel. And so that's kind of interesting. But we look at this, and people often, they have pause when they look at this idea of forced labor or slavery. But you see that it was way different than, the human trafficking situation that we're used to, or that we think of today, and how slavery got started in the United States. But we see that he treated them better than our nation treated our slaves. That it wasn't necessarily human property, but he drafted them to slavery, but he forced them to work 1 month, but then they get 2 months at home. They get 2 months break, and certainly he was paying them and taking care of them. And so that's just an important distinction to make. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, Glenn, real quick.
Saul almost destroyed the Gibeonites.
Yeah.
He almost wiped them out.
Yeah. Yeah, the Amalekites? Yeah. Yep, absolutely. But he did. He spared their king, right? And so we move on to chapter 6, and it's the construction of the temple continuing. And you see it in verse 1 immediately. It says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Zib, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. But it's interesting to me that he calls back to Egyptian captivity. Is there any ideas why he would do that? Does anybody have any thoughts? I mean, here you're talking about the temple construction, you're talking about the establishment of a king, and then all of a sudden he dates back to when the people had been in Egyptian captivity.
Because now they're going to become a nation and a monarchy.
Yeah.
And so it's to put reference to where they were and now where they're at now.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. Here there are people that they're subject to a Gentile nation, essentially. And now they're building this marvelous structure towards God. They have 200,000 people in forced labor. They have all these provisions They're just fruitful every way you look at it. They have peace on all sides. Everybody's sitting under his fig tree. And so before the temple construction begins, the author tells us that this is a huge point. This marks a huge point in Israel's history as a monarchy, as a nation, and again, it's going to be a high point. If they're building this structure, everybody's going to see it, and they're just going to be in awe of it, and it's going to cause them to glorify God.
Well, I think it also goes back to the time the temple was a tent.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, that's a point of, we've come from a tent, now we're going to build something.
Now we're building a permanent dwelling place for God so that God can dwell among us permanently, right? That's kind of the idea. You think about a tent, that's not. And so we're going to kind of look at this. You have this diagram. I know you can't read all that. I like the diagram, how it lays everything out, just because it's kind of accurate. But, you know, we look at this, and it's not to be assumed that this is like an extremely detailed list that's going to give us every dimension. This is just an idea of what it could have looked like. Neither of the accounts, either in Chronicles or in Kings, are enough to like make an exact replica or anything like that. And so you'll look at diagrams, but people think that it looks something along the lines of this, and certainly you see, the sea there where they would use it for washings and the altar and all these types of things. It's an idea. It gives us an idea of what it would have looked like. And so, just kind of going over some things here as we read through this. We're not going to read through it word for word because, again, I don't want anybody to fall asleep. I know it's just a lot of information, but we want to go over it. In verse 2, it talks about kind of the dimensions of the building itself. And so it basically, you break that down in verse 2, and it says that the house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. And so if you break that down, I think with an 18-inch cubit, which is what we kind of assume a cubit is a lot of times, it ends up being about 90 feet long, right? So it's home plate to first base, right, in the MLB. And 30 feet wide, so that's an NFL first down. Sorry, I think in terms of sports. And then it's 4 stories tall. And so you're looking at this building, and it's not magnificent from the standpoint of its size, but it's going to be magnificent from the standpoint of the materials that are used and what it looks like. It's not the biggest building you've ever seen. It's kind of long, it's kind of narrow, but it's somewhat tall for that time. It's 4 stories tall. And so you look at this, and you see it goes in and starts talking about, in chapter 6 here, it starts talking about such things as the storage areas off to the side, and you notice that it gets wider as you go up, and it seems as the author words it, that they didn't want any of the wooden posts going through the wall, and so what they did on the side is they stepped it. And so you notice that the building at the bottom is the narrowest. It's about 5 cubits wide, and then it gets wider and wider and wider for storage on the side there. And that went all the way around the building. Verse 7 is interesting because it says, when the house was built, it was with stone prepared at the quarry, so that neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. So you just see complete reverence towards God, that these things are all being prepared outside of the temple. There's nobody inside the temple banging hammers, banging chisels. Everything is being prepared so that when they come and are building inside the temple, that it's all just being set in place and no noise is being made. I imagine that you could probably hear a pin drop. And you just imagine a construction project being that quiet. It would be weird. I worked in construction. You have to wear earplugs all day. But all these things were being prepared at a different location, and they're bringing them into the temple and just setting things in place. You go through this, and Solomon here, he's visited again by God in verse 11. And I'm sorry, I know I'm going through stuff fast, but I want to get through these 3 chapters. He says, now the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house that you are building. And you will walk in my statutes and obey my rules and keep all my commandments to walk in them. Then I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father. And I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. So here you have Solomon seemingly appears to get approval from God for everything that he's doing up to this point. And you can imagine starting this huge construction project. And then all of a sudden God visits you and he says, keep doing what you're doing, keep my word, walk in the statutes, and I'll keep the promises that I made to David your father. And all the children of Israel, I will never forsake them. And so, again, but what we see is that this promise is conditional, isn't it? We look at God's covenants are conditional, that if we do what he says, he's never going to forsake us, but if we turn from him, then he can't help us, can he? Yeah, Mark.
Maybe I missed it somewhere, but the length and how it's supposed to be built, was that directed by God? What the measurements were supposed to be? Because
I think that it was taken from the tabernacle as a reference.
But because on the ark, we got specific measurements, how it should have been done, and I'm just wondering, did you get specific measurements how this was done?
Not that we're told here, but I think that they used the tabernacle as a reference. Yeah. What are you going to add to that, Dave?
Yeah, the tabernacle is what they built it was built on the same exact measurements that the temple was. It's interesting, over in Jordan, when I was there in Israel, we went to Jordan, you had King Tobias, who built the temple in revolt of what Solomon was doing, building the temple properly, but he built it backwards, so it was facing the opposite direction. But even that temple was based on the same dimensions. And so it shows that the dimensions were very important, and it had to be according to that design. One was where they moved, and God was continually with them, but Israel was constantly on the move.
Yeah.
But now there's going to be permanent and established.
But it tells us, again, I appreciate you bringing that out and asking the question, but it tells us just how important it was to them to follow a pattern that was given before them.
Exactly.
And I think that that's an important lesson for us today, as we're trying to follow a New Testament pattern in every way that we possibly can. And a lot of people, they don't appreciate that. They want to do it their way, but we're trying to follow a pattern that's been given to godly people before us. Yeah, Brian.
That's mentioned by the Hebrew writer, chapter 8, verse 5. It says that Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle, for he said, "See that you make all things according to the pattern shown you in the mountain."
Yeah.
So once again, Moses was told how to build the tabernacle according to the pattern.
And they followed that pattern. We have a pattern that we're supposed to follow today. Yeah. Yeah, Marvin.
I
Then
wonder,
we'll
there
move on.
has to be some reason why it's that way, because I don't know if there's a reason why it's built that size. It's just a matter of interest to me, because when the ark was built, the U.S. Navy forces and other stuff in World War II used the same dimensions because it went between the waves properly and could get filled. And so God knew what the length of something had to be properly in the ocean. He knew something had to be properly here, and I wonder if we found out why it is.
Yeah, I haven't found any symbolism or anything like that. I would have to look into that. That's a great question, and maybe I'll look at that and bring it out if I find something next Sunday. But yeah, I appreciate that. So yeah, we continue looking at all this, and it's like Solomon is visited by God, and it's like he's motivated even more. And we look at the things that he does to the temple after that, and I don't know if these are plans that he already had in mind, or if God visits him and it motivates him that much more to just make this building greater and greater and greater. I imagine I think it's like a lot of projects that men have. They have this idea, and it starts off simple, and then it gets more and more intricate as you continue building. But that's kind of what we see taking place here with the Temple of Solomon. For instance, you read verse 20 through 22, just the amount of gold that was used. It says the inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 20 cubits high, but he overlaid it with pure gold. So the whole inner sanctuary, in fact, what we read is that the whole inside of the temple was laid with gold, from floor to wall to ceiling. I mean, that's what is shown there in the diagram. And Solomon overlaid the inside of the house with pure gold. And he drew chains of gold across in front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. And he overlaid the whole house with gold until all the house was finished. Also the whole altar that belonged in the inner sanctuary, he overlaid with gold. And so you see that just no expense is being spared on Solomon's part whatsoever. I'll get back to you. We'll real quick, Glenn.
When God sets out to build something, man is not gonna outproduce. It ain't gonna happen. There's proof right there. There's nothing ever been built since then that even touched that.
Not even close, yeah. But it's
You
Solomon.
need to go check it.
It's Solomon operating off the wisdom that God gave him, isn't it? And just putting everything that he can into it. But quick question that I have for you guys is, where is Solomon getting all this gold to build this temple?
Solomon's mind.
What's that?
Solomon's mind.
Oh, Solomon's mine? Yeah, well, actually a lot of it is from
Tribute.
Yeah, tribute from what? But
666 talents a year.
well, but also his father David
That
dedicated.
they had to give him that much, easy,
Yes.
not to beat him up.
Tribute, but his father David dedicated specifically for the temple.
40-something thousand.
It ends up being 3,000 tons of gold is what it is, and 30,000 tons of silver, and that's just what David contributed.
Yep.
So they have all this at his disposal, and it's just an insane amount of money, is what we would call it today, that went into the construction of the temple. And so just kind of for fun, I looked at what some estimates were to build the temple if you were going to build it today with paid labor. By the way, that is in 1 Chronicles 22:14 that talks about the gold and silver being dedicated. But it ends up being, just in the gold and silver alone that went into this, about $150 to $200 billion dollars. That's just the materials of the gold and silver. And then they estimate if you factor in the paid labor, which some of this was forced, but if it were paid labor, then the cost of the temple with materials and everything would exceed $500 billion. And so what you're looking at is just the greatest structure that's ever existed. It's really what this is, and the amount of money, the amount of resources, the amount of effort, the amount of work that went into building this was just something to marvel at. We've never seen anything like it in our lives. Really quick, Clint, because we got to move on.
$6,700,000,000 in bronze alone. My family crunch this down, people have a mechanical engineer crunch this down, it's come out to be $6,700,000,000 just in bronze alone,
Just
the thing
in
to
bronze.
calculate.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a cheaper metal that was used in the construction of the temple, huh? So yeah, just this magnificent building coated in gold. And you look at inside the sanctuary, he has these cherubim that are also coated in gold, and they're 15 feet tall as you work out the dimensions there in cubits, and 7.5 feet was the width of their wings. And so you walk into this inner sanctuary that's 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits, and you walk in and here's these 15-foot tall gold cherubim that are going to be on either side of the ark. You can kind of see in the illustration there with their golden wings touching. And so, I mean, just everything you look at here is just, it's magnificent. It's incomprehensible. Yeah. And I think that's really why this much detail is given. We look at this and we say, well, why is this in here? Well, part of the reason why this is in here is because it was history, and this is a real account, and when you have a historical account, you have details that are given. But it helps us to marvel at just how wealthy and how flourishing Israel was at that time, and just how incomprehendibly magnificent this house of God truly was. That we have some of the details here, but really it's just incomprehensible. And so you continue reading, and verse 29, it talks about how it was, there's engravings of flowers and palm trees on the inner sanctuary. And then finally in verse 38, it says that the 7-year project was finished. It says the 11th year in the month of Bul, and I believe that's the 11th year of Solomon's reign, which is the 8th month. The house was finished in all its parts and according to all its specifications. He was 7 years in building it. And so it took about 7 years from start to finish. You had 200,000 people that were just working on getting the materials, but you look at all the people that he had at his disposal to build this thing, and it still took 7 years. And I think that tells us just how grand this building truly was, that it took that long with that many people at your disposal. Yeah, Wayne.
I may be wrong on this, but if I'm correct, at the same time, he was building his own home.
Well, and that's what we read about next. So it took him 13 years to build his own home. We don't know if that's at the same time that he was building it, or if he did that after he built the temple, and so that would have been 20 years total. But it took him 13 years to build his own palace, which I'm sure wasn't nearly as magnificent. But yeah, that kind of gives us some indication that Solomon is still putting God before himself, that he's willing to build God's house before he builds his own house. Again, showing us how righteous Solomon is at this time, and how it's, again, just no expenses spared. We are out of time. I tried to go through that as fast as I could. We'll finish up next week. Sorry, that just flew by. I know that's a lot of information, so appreciate it. Yeah.